So my name is Andrew Lamb. My new novel is called Repentance. So Repentance is about a Japanese-American World War II hero who actually has a really big secret. It's a secret so bad and so entwined with the actions that actually made him a hero that he's refused to speak of the war ever since. And the novel is like this dual timeline story between the 1940s and the 1990s when we meet this character's son, who's actually this world-famous cardiac surgeon. And he seems to have a great life, except that he's been estranged from his father. They haven't spoken in decades and they have a bad relationship. And what happens is, for some reason, the Department of Defense, the US government, comes knocking, asking questions about the circumstances of how his father got his medal in the war, because something really bad happened when he was fighting the Germans in France. And it doesn't seem like they're going to stop until they find out exactly who did what. And this launches the son on this journey of discovery, takes him to California and then to the battlefields in France, and he begins to learn secret after secret about what his father did, what his father didn't do, about himself and his family. And obviously I don't want to give away any spoilers, but it's kind of meant to be this dramatic, suspenseful war novel about a Japanese-American family. And of course the story is heavily based on the true history of Japanese-American 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was the most decorated unit in U.S. military history.
Book lovers unite! I'm Demethius Jackson, and you're listening to the Chapter 1 podcast. The greatest stories ever written all begin with Chapter 1. In each episode, our guest authors will share their first chapters with you. Hey everybody! On today's episode, we're going to be speaking with historical fiction writer Andrew Lamb, who will be sharing with us his latest book entitled Repentance. Now, many of us have heard of the Band of Brothers and the Tuskegee Airmen, but not a lot of us have heard of the 442nd Infantry Regiment, which was not only the most decorated combat regiment within U.S. history, but was also comprised mostly of Japanese Americans at a time when Japanese Americans were being interned in camps. So Andrew is bringing a dynamic story today, comprised not only of history, but also family drama. And it starts right now.
So this novel, as I mentioned, is a dual timeline story, and the World War II part of it is obviously very entwined with battles and a lot of history. But the more modern part in the 90s concerns the main character's son, who is actually a cardiac surgeon. And I'm a physician and a surgeon myself. And I wanted to just have the readers jump in and learn about what this surgeon, what his life is like. His name is Daniel Tokunaga, and he is the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at University of Pennsylvania Hospital. So that's actually where I went to medical school. So it was very interesting to kind of convey this scene. So I'm going to start by reading about Chapter 1 of Repentance. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, September 1998. An unbroken line of blood ran across the white tiled floor, smeared at one point by a wheel track. It came from the patient waiting area, a sinuous cherry red stripe, a painter's brushstroke too perfectly haphazard to be anything but frighteningly real. Dr. Daniel Tokunaga scrutinized the scarlet streak, momentarily mesmerized until a pair of EMTs brushed past him, disappearing through the emergency room's swinging frosted glass doors. Daniel followed and suddenly found himself thrust into bedlam, shouting voices, running bodies. He jumped, a cascade of supplies tumbling off a nearby shelf. A nurse cursed, dropped to her knees, frantically searching for something crucial. Across the room, a police officer struggled to restrain a prisoner. Or was it a patient? From their beds, two drunks, an asthmatic, and a boy with a broken leg stared at the unfolding melee. Crash cart now. O-negative blood. Page trauma and CT stat. An overhead speaker blared. Code blue. Emergency department. Code blue. Dr. Tokunaga. A shrill female voice. Daniel turned and recognized the charge nurse. How'd you know about this? I haven't even paid your service yet. Just cutting through on my way home. What is this? Gunshot. Kid dumped out of a car. Driver yelled, innocent bystander, before zooming off, the thugs. Daniel's face tightened. Gangbangers. Known to speed by and slow down just long enough to open the door and roll out their wounded friends. He peered across the ER toward the trauma room, already overflowing. They would need either him or the cardiothoracic surgery fellow on call. Daniel wasn't assigned to back up the CT fellow, but he knew none of the surgeons driving in from home would arrive in time to make any difference. CT surgery to the ER stat, an announcement rang out. Daniel looked at his watch and swore under his breath. The twins would be disappointed. Beth would be furious. Already he regretted staying late to attend a meeting for the hospital's department heads. But as he found himself moving toward the trauma room, he felt a burst of adrenaline. He came to the swinging doors and slipped inside. A dozen people filled the room. Near the head of the gurney, an ER resident bent low to assess an airway. At one arm, a nurse struggled to insert an IV. At the other, another tried to draw blood. A couple of medical students stood against the bar wall, looking petrified. Daniel recognized the ER attending, Sam Griffin, a rotund and affable man just a couple years removed from his residency, an average clinician by all accounts. Griffin's face was pale. Beads of sweat glistened on his brow as he shouted orders. Type and cross 6 units now. Get Oneg now. Watch his neck. Watch his neck. Daniel caught a glimpse of the gurney. My God, he's just a kid. The patient was a thin Hispanic boy no older than 15. The resident was cutting off his T-shirt, a dripping bright red rag. The boy's eyes were closed. He made ragged little breaths. When he coughed, droplets of blood mixed with spittle ran down his chin. Vitals? Griffin asked. A wheeze of a deflating blood pressure cuff made Daniel look toward the monitor. BP 60/30. Way too low. A nurse fumbled with the boy's arm. Very thin. I can barely feel a pulse. The resident who cut off the shirt carefully rolled the boy over. One exit wound in the back, he reported. The shrill alarm of a telemetry monitor rang out. Daniel looked. The blinking numbers had turned from green to red. Dangerous tachycardia. The heart was racing at 180 beats a minute. Yet the blood pressure was low, and there was barely a pulse. Daniel knew the boy would be dead in minutes. No pulse, the nurse cried out, wrestling the boy's limp arm. Now I can't get a pulse. The resident leaned in close to the patient's face, checking for a breath. A moment later, he looked at Griffin and shook his head. Griffin's mouth opened, but no words came out. Seconds passed. The resident started chest compressions. What's going on here? Daniel said. All eyes turned to him. Sam Griffin's face flushed with relief. Dr. Tokunaga, thank God. Gunshot wound, left chest. Daniel took off his Armani suit jacket and began to roll up his sleeves. Gown, gloves, mask, he commanded. If you're not actively participating in this code, then leave the room. And nobody speaks unless they're directly addressing me about the care of this patient. First, Daniel pointed to Griffin, intubate. And you, he pointed to the resident, get a femoral line. You, he pointed to one of the medical students, get over here and restart compressions once the endotracheal tube is in. Daniel leaned in close. Entry wound in the chest, just left of the midline. It was small, just a dark black gouge the size of a dime. Blood oozed out of it. Griffin crouched over the head of the bed, laryngoscope in hand, squinting as he tried to insert a long plastic tube past the vocal cords and into the trachea. You okay, Sam? Almost. Got it. Go for a right mainstem intubation. Push that tube in as far as you can. What? Right side only. I want the left lung collapsed. Dr. Tokunaga. A new voice interrupted. Daniel spun. It was the ER charge nurse. X-rays here. No time for that. We're in. He briefly listened for breath sounds on both sides of the chest. Right side only. Start bagging. Restart CPR, Daniel said. He noticed Niraj, his cardiothoracic surgery fellow, had just arrived. Niraj, get a thoracotomy kit. Niraj hesitated. No echo or chest tube? What about a pericardiocentesis? No time. Move it. 10 seconds later, Daniel had a scalpel in his hand. A nurse swabbed betadine quickly across the chest. Daniel felt the position of the sternum and made a deep, curving incision from the midline across the chest laterally to just under the left armpit. His hands glided effortlessly, maneuvers he had performed thousands of times. Above the fifth rib, he dissected through the pectoralis muscle and used the tips of blunt scissors to go deeper. He felt a pop as he entered the pleural cavity, and a foot-high fountain of blood shot up, nearly hitting him in the face. A nurse gasped. Block it, Daniel said. The nurse deflected the blood with her hand. Daniel leaned in to enlarge the opening. When he did, the stream of blood began to flow across the chest and onto the gurney. It puddled on the floor. Chest full of blood, Daniel muttered. Rib spreader. Niraj handed him a large metal retractor shaped like a C-clamp. Daniel placed a blaze between the ribs and started to crank them apart. Suction. Niraj placed a plastic handpiece into the chest cavity. As the space between the ribs widened, Daniel pushed the collapsed left lung aside to expose the pericardium. It was bulging, tense, and dark. Scissors. Sam Griffin stared wide-eyed. It's tamponade, Daniel explained. He cut a small hole in the pericardium. There was a gush of blood. Daniel felt the heart pulsing beneath his hand. On the monitor, the EKG line jumped jaggedly. More suction. He enlarged the opening in the pericardium and began to inspect the heart. Blood flowed more briskly now. Where was it coming from? He used his fingers to gently feel the front and back of the heart. Then, he saw it and felt it at the same time. It was a small hole at the edge of the right ventricle. Was part of the bullet inside the heart, or had it passed all the way through? Daniel stuck his finger through the hole and felt inside the pulsing chamber. Nothing. He gently lifted the heart and turned it slightly. More suction. No exit wound in the back. He returned the heart to its normal position. It was a tangential wound. The bullet had grazed the heart, then gone out the patient's back. We've got to plug this hole to stop the bleeding. Can you suture it? Griffin asked, incredulous. Daniel ignored him. Get a Foley. What? The nurse said. A Foley, a Foley. You stick it in so people can pee. Hurry up. She ran into the hall and returned moments later with a thin rubber tube. The Foley catheter had a double lumen. When inflated, the outer space at the tip of the catheter became a small balloon that normally kept the tube inside a patient's bladder and prevented it from slipping out. Daniel threaded the catheter through the hole in the heart. Inflate it, he said. Niraj gently depressed the plunger of a small syringe to fill the balloon inside the heart with saline. Through the heart wall, Daniel felt the tip of the tubing inflate. Stop. Now the small balloon in the right ventricle was the size of a marble. Blood flow inside the heart pushed the balloon against the hole, plugging it. Daniel watched the monitor. The EKG line jerked up and down irregularly. Ventricular fibrillation. Give me the internal paddles and charge at 20 joules. A nurse handed him 2 small metal paddles, which Daniel placed on the front and back of the heart. Clear. Daniel shocked the heart, which froze momentarily and then began to beat regularly. The EKG returned to normal sinus rhythm. There's a pulse, the nurse called out. The next blood pressure reading came on the screen, 95/45. Better. A little cheer went up among the others in the room. Daniel looked at Niraj. We bought him some time. Keep a close eye on the Foley. If you need to, just keep a little tension on it like this, Daniel demonstrated, to make sure the balloon stays against the hole. Continue wide open fluids. Start transfusing. As soon as the first unit is hung, I want the second unit spiked and ready to infuse. And get him up to the OR. I'll see you there in 15 minutes. You got it, Niraj said, awestruck. His boss had just brought a kid back from the dead.
Well, before we begin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? You alluded to this earlier, but if you can elaborate.
Yeah, so I grew up in central Illinois, Springfield, Illinois, actually, which is known for the Capitol and being Abraham Lincoln's hometown. But I've been on the East Coast for a while. I studied history in college. I went to Yale, and then I went to medical school instead of going to history grad school because I had a father who was actually a cardiologist in my hometown, and I could see from his career that medicine was really fulfilling and gratifying. So I did that. I've never regretted it, but I also never lost my desire to share history with others. So when I was a resident, I became an ophthalmologist and then a retina specialist. But when I was a resident, I wanted to find a way to express myself creatively and share some of the knowledge that I'd especially learned during my studies in college. And I had focused a lot on World War II and particularly Asia in World War II. So I wrote my first novel, which was called Two Sons of China. It was really about the American war in China during World War II when China was our ally, obviously fighting the Japanese. So that was kind of like this romantic war novel based on true history. And it was very gratifying to write that, go through the whole publication process. Actually won a 2014, I think, Forward Review's Book of the Year award, which was nice. And I wrote another book after that because when you write a book, as you know, you start thinking about what else you could write about. And I had also learned a lot about the amazing stories of invention in ophthalmology. Eye surgeons can do really cool things. We get to take out cataracts in a very elegant, very quick procedure. We do LASIK surgery. Even retina specialists are starting to implant retinal microchips to give some sight back to blind people. So I wrote a book called Saving Sight about the amazing stories of serendipity and perseverance that surgeons had developed through the 20th century to develop these amazing techniques. And I blended those stories with my own stories as a surgeon, kind of bringing readers into the operating room to see what it's like to basically try to save someone's sight, or more interestingly, maybe see what it's like to come up against complication.
And there's definitely an interest in that because, of course, when we connected, that was the first question I asked you. What's it like to be in surgery?
That's right. I was mentioning I have surgery later today. That's right. Yeah. I mean, I guess that was an opportunity to kind of write a nonfiction book about what I do on a daily basis. But again, with my expertise being in World War II, I wrote that first novel about China and the American war in China during the war. And then this new book is about Japanese Americans who essentially fought with amazing valor in Europe because they wanted to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were true and loyal Americans during the war when obviously Japan was our enemy.
So what inspired you to write the story about the 442nd as fiction instead of nonfiction or even a reference book?
That's a great question. There have been other nonfiction books written about the 442nd, and they are very important as a resource. But, I think that historical fiction, to me, is very effective at conveying history in a very empathetic way. I also like the fact that readers who wouldn't necessarily pick up a nonfiction book about a historical topic could be enthralled by a fictional story, but also learn a lot of history along the way. What I meant by empathy, I think that historical fiction is very useful at showing the reader and helping them to imagine what it might have been like to be in that time, to make the decisions that the characters are faced with. Right. Much more so and in a much more personal way than a nonfiction book can do it.
Yeah, there's mass appeal for fiction, especially when you're still able to create the environment and the feel, the texture of what it was like to live back then. And so as I was delving into your book, the one thing I noticed is that more so than a historical account, the story seemed, I want to say, almost like a drama or a family drama. Am I reading too much into that, or would you agree?
Well, yeah, obviously I've learned as a historical fiction writer that the history that I want to convey is, of course, very interesting to me. But to make it interesting to a reader, you've got to have the story come first, right? And the story has to do with characters. And you're not going to have believable characters unless you make it real and interesting. And this really is a Japanese-American family drama, right? So at that time, it's interesting because the Japanese Americans at that time were, of course, many of them were interned. Right. 120,000 of them were basically had to leave everything from the West Coast and were basically imprisoned in 10 inland internment camps in very isolated places, such as like Manzanar in California, right? And of course, this story, it speaks for itself. Can you imagine if you'd been imprisoned in a camp and then suddenly the government, which had taken away all your rights, asked you to volunteer to fight and die for your country? And yet a lot of these guys did. And in Europe, they basically had this amazing record of fighting. The 442nd won 21 Medals of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars. And of the 14,000 guys who actually ended up fighting with them, they won 9,486 Purple Hearts. That's an amazing record and percentage of sacrificial fighting, right?
Right.
So there's so much, the story aside, the background of the story alone is a very great topic to write about. So
yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, because as I was reading, even going through the description of the book, it had me thinking that, Japanese Americans, as they were fighting in World War II, they were in these internment camps, just like you had black and brown soldiers that were, fighting in World War II, but were still facing discrimination back home in the U.S. And so it just got me thinking, like, how do you as a soldier even reconcile that?
Yeah, just like with African-American soldiers, there's many, many stories of people coming back home with their uniform and medals on and facing severe discrimination, right? And I don't know. I think that it's not that hard for me to imagine what their motivation would be. You may also have a similar feeling regarding like African-American soldiers or other minority soldiers. Like, for example, I asked myself, what would happen? I'm a Chinese American. What would happen if we went to war with China right now? I would suddenly feel like a bright spotlight was being shown on myself and my family.
Exactly.
And you can bet I would do anything possible to prove my loyalty and to prove that I was a good and true and loyal American. It's just, my family has been in the United States for 3 generations, almost a century. But how much would that really count for if we went to war with China? Because I can't change the way I look, I think that in some small way, I do hope that my book helps readers of all different racial backgrounds appreciate what it's like to be someone of a different race and to empathize with their experiences, right? Because we really are doomed to repeat the history unless we all remember it and teach it to our kids.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was kind of my other question as well. You being an Asian American writing this book, were there things that you had to reconcile as you were researching this and basically creating this world?
Well, yeah, when they say you better write about what you know, or else it's not going to come across as genuine. And frankly, readers can really detect things that aren't genuine. So it's not really going to work unless you talk about what you know. So I know about certain things. I know about medicine, history, being a husband and a father, which has a lot of the characters in this book are having family problems, marital issues. And I always have to remind people that this is fiction, especially when my wife is around. But also, the family drama and the Asian American part of it, right? So I know what it's like to be an Asian American. I know what the culture can be like. You know, it's very paternalistic. Honor, reputation are very important. Education is very important. So it's not too hard for me to write from a place that I think is genuine. You know, and it's been actually, this book has been well received in the Japanese American community among veterans as well. In fact, one of the most famous 42nd veterans actually helped me with the book and endorsed the book. So it's been very helpful to get outside help as well. But I do think that being Asian American helps with authenticity when you're writing about a topic like this.
Yeah. And it's fantastic that you were able to reach out to someone for a veteran, because there's not a lot of them around anymore.
That's definitely true.
And mentioning the family drama, if it's not a spoiler, what's the relationship with Daniel and his father? Meaning, were they estranged due to the war, or was it something else going on between them?
Well, I think it wouldn't be giving away too much to say a few things about why they've been estranged. One is that Daniel's in the baby boomer generation. He goes to school in the 60s when there's a lot of conflict and unrest about the Vietnam War. So he's in college. He's actually at Columbia, which at one point the students in Columbia, I think in 1968, took over part of the university. And so Daniel's actually one of these guys he's a very smart guy. He's very interested in politics in the world when he's young. And his father is a man who grew up during the Depression, like the Greatest Generation did, and then went to fight during World War II, sacrificed a lot, has a lot of respect for the government, and obviously, as a Japanese American, literally fought and had many friends die to prove that they were loyal Americans. And so he has a son who's doing all this shenanigans, he thinks, during, the Vietnam era. And because Daniel gets arrested with a lot of the other Columbia students, there's a lot of fear there about what his future will hold, because they've obviously sacrificed a lot. They are not a rich family, so they sacrificed a lot to send him to school. So that's one thing. Another thing that comes up is actually stuff happens during the Vietnam War with regard to Daniel's brother. And there's a lot of blame regarding what happens about whether he should willingly fight or wait to be drafted and things like that. And then there's also these other relationships from the past where the father may have disapproved of who he was dating before he went away to school. And there's a lot of story. There may be other Asian American families that can relate to basically parents having a very strong opinion about who they may marry or date. And, that could be true of any family, obviously, in any ethnicity. So these are just a touch on some of the issues. Okay. I don't know. Do you write about any of those kinds of things in your novels?
I do write about conflict within friends. In my second book, it was actually a lesson in morality where you're betrayed by your friends, but yet you have to trust people you perceived as your enemy. Yeah.
Fiction's great, isn't it? Like, you can really explore all these different things, or take your entire lifetime of experience and kind of will it down and condense it into actual characters,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's a way for you to educate, enlighten folks without necessarily coming across as boring or even preachy in some senses.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so it makes sense, the divide between Daniel and his father, because essentially it's kind of the same generational divide between the baby boomers and the greatest generation. Mm-hmm. And over the years, there has been significant progress towards keeping their memory and their efforts alive in the generations to come. Of course, people have heard of the Band of Brothers and the Tuskegee Airmen, but it wasn't really until your book that I not only discovered that the 442nd was, the most decorated military regiment out there, but I couldn't understand why I hadn't heard as much about them before. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's one of my missions, right? I think that people who are aficionados of World War II or history buffs, they probably have heard of the 442nd. They certainly may have heard of one of the most famous veterans, who was Daniel Inouye, who was the Hawaiian senator from Hawaii, the second longest serving senator in U.S. history. He was in the 442nd. He lost an arm fighting in Italy. He got the Congressional Medal of Honor. So, you're right. A lot of Americans don't know about the 442nd. And part of my goal is to literally share their story with others through this book. I don't know why more people don't know about it. I think that history, to my chagrin, I've found believe it or not, people, it's not their favorite subject when they're kids. And I'm being facetious, but basically, yeah, you know, a lot of people don't necessarily like learning about history. They think it's boring, but obviously I love history and I love trying to make it come alive for people. So it's just something where the more we learn, the more we talk about it, the more people will know about it, and we'll all learn the lessons of the history.
Absolutely. And that really segues nicely into my next question, because, you know, we're in this political climate right now where we still have the targeting of immigrants and it's still prevalent. You know, I guess what I'm asking is, how do you want this book to contribute or influence that national discussion that's going on right now?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's very timely. It's clear that, you know, when we're fearful as a people, it's very easy to blame or scapegoat the quote other unquote, and to look for reasons that are external for our fear or our misfortune. And I think that that's very dangerous. Obviously, the history of World War II is filled with bad political leaders doing this, like basically saying if we got rid of this group of people or blame this group of people, all our problems will be solved. And we know that that's not only bad, but it basically taps into the worst impulses in human nature. Mm-hmm. So I just think that knowing about this history, certainly the story of the internment camps, which is apropos to today, you know, will help people recognize what's happening. You know, nothing is ever black and white, and there are always reasons for both sides of any controversial issue. But we certainly want to err on the side of learning from our history and not making the same mistakes if we can avoid them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And kind of a more personal question, similar to the evolution and the transformation of Daniel and the other characters in your stories. In what ways do you think writing this book has evolved or transformed you as a writer?
Well, that's interesting. You know, this book, you know, I think it took me 6 years to write it. We went through many rewrites. When you write a book, as you know, it's such a solitary experience and with a lot of hope involved with it, but there's no guarantee of success, you know, working on this book, seeing it to come to fruition, working with the agent and the editors through the years, finally having it come out and be well received. That's very gratifying. And I know you also know what I'm talking about. So yes. I think that to me, it's always transformative to know that the delayed gratification has paid off, I guess. And that, you know, someday when I'm gone, my kids and my grandkids will have this book that maybe will give them a little insight into what I was like, what was important to me, you know? So that's the gratifying part of it to me. You know, it's being a writer is a lot like being a doctor in the sense that the delayed gratification just takes forever, right? So I think that sometimes in life, you do a lot of work and nothing comes of it, right? Yeah. And that's part of failure, and we've all experienced that, and that's important as well. But perseverance and hard work is always very important as well.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a fantastic point. The fact that's probably one of the reasons why, you know, we as writers write these books, because it's our legacy. And yeah, you're right. Your children, your grandchildren, they'll come back and they'll see your entire volume of work. And they'll get a sense of who you are as a person. It's a way to reach back and touch history. That's amazing.
Yeah. What are you planning on writing next?
So I'm 3 books in. I just completed the trilogy. And
Congratulations.
Thank you. I have a lot of gray hairs from that. And I was thinking about republishing a rhyming version of the book.
Wow. Well, it sounds like you've got a pretty free-flowing pen there. For me, it's always like, if I have an idea, it's like gangbusters is great, but then there's these hiatuses where there's like nothing's happening, and I'm just, you know, binge watching TV shows or obviously chauffeuring my kids everywhere. So it's kind of sporadic for me.
But that's okay. That's totally fine. Turning off the brain, that's definitely part of the writing process. You can't burn on all cylinders 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the fact that you take your time with these books and they have such amazing detail and even historical accuracy, you know, I think that's a testament within itself.
Yeah, that definitely is a labor of love. You definitely don't do this unless you're passionate about it, for sure. As you know.
Yeah, you can say that again. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Andrew.
Thank you.
Where can readers go online to learn more about you and your books?
Oh, sure. So my website is andrewlambmd.com. And my books are available everywhere, bookstores, Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, obviously. So yeah, I hope people will go check it out.
And with that, we're going to wrap up another episode. Thanks again to Andrew Lamb for giving us insight into the 442nd. If you have any questions or comments for him, or for me, or you know an author you think would be a good fit for the show, let me know. Connect with me on social media. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or send an email to info@ch1podcast.com. Check out our website at ch1podcast.com, where there you can listen to previous episodes and hopefully find your next favorite author. Subscribe to us on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, wherever podcasts can be downloaded. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review, but most importantly, tell everyone you know about the show, because that is how we grow. Okay, once again, that's it for me. You all stay awesome. Till next time.